welcome everyone to tonight's Bible study based on the book of Ezra, chapter 9, verses 5 through 15. This is based on the Faith Connection Sunday School lesson for June 21st of 2020. Our lesson is called Letting Go and Grabbing Hold. The exiles had completed a major task. Of course, as we studied in the last couple of weeks, the people of Israel had been conquered by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He took the residents of Jerusalem and the surrounding area as captives into Babylon, and many years had passed, and now Nebuchadnezzar himself was overrun by the Persian Empire. And once the Persian Empire was in power, he recognized and actually said he had a vision from God that he was to allow the Israelites to return to their home and to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar. You would think at such a time of this that there would be a high level of spirituality. In other words, that people would recognize, people who had literally had everything taken away from them, taken to their homes, shipped to another nation. They were allowed certain amounts of freedom as they were there, but they were in total subjection to the authorities, had no access to their own property. And now, as they've received this wonderful blessing, they can go home, they can reclaim their property, they can rebuild the temple, which had been so special to them. You would expect a high level of spiritual enjoyment and spiritual praise and service. However, Ezra, as we'll look more in just a few minutes, it was about 60 years after they had first gone back, and Ezra found that instead of a high level of spirituality, he found the people in Jerusalem falling back into some of the same trends of forgetting God's law and going about doing things their own way. In just a few short generations, they forgot all the lessons that they should have learned. In Ezra 9, verses 5 through 7, we read the prayer of Ezra as his response to what he found when he returned to Jerusalem. At the evening sacrifice, I got up from my fasting, with my garments and my mantle torn, and fell on my knees, spread out my hands to the Lord my God, and said, "O my God, I am too ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. From the days of our ancestors to this day, we have been deep in guilt, and for our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been handed over to the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame, as is now the case." Ezra, as we said, arrived almost 60 years after the reconstruction of the temple had begun. Ezra was a Jewish scribe. That meant he was responsible for keeping track of the records of the law, for making copies. He was one who would be an instructor in the things having to do with the law. And knowing his faithfulness and his position, the Persian Empire charged him with the task of educating the former exiles in the law of Moses. In other words, they had been away from their land for so long that the emperor, since he felt, even though he was not a Hebrew, even though he did not serve the God of Israel, yet he felt he had this commission to build this temple. Therefore, he wanted to make sure that they had the right instructions for how they were to worship as the temple was built. This practice was something that was done frequently by the Persian Empire to help subjects reclaim their former culture. Unlike the Babylonian emperor, who felt the best way to keep control of the people was to simply take them away from everything they knew, take them away from everything that had been a part of their life, and just plant them somewhere else. Darius and the succeeding Persian leaders, they felt that it was a much better practice to help the people rebuild their culture. And then perhaps they would see the Empire of Persia not as a threat to their well-being, but actually something that could be a benefit to them to continue their faithfulness to the Persian Empire. But as soon as Ezra had arrived on the scene, he discovered a major sin in the community of faith. He recognized the severity and saw the consequences of sin. He realized the people were on the wrong path. And he used a typical Old Testament sign of mourning, which was to tear his clothes and pull his hair. Now, I realize I wouldn't suggest any of us do that as a sign of mourning in our culture today. But it was something that was very meaningful to Ezra, and a sign not only to Ezra himself, but to those who saw Ezra. They knew something was not right. Ezra prayed to God, expressing the shame for the sin of his people. How important that is. You know, we try sometimes to avoid recognizing sin. The problem is when sin is unrecognized or unacknowledged, it continues to grow. Therefore, Ezra was expressing a shame for the sin that the people had committed, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a second. The Hebrew word translated sin in verse 6, and by the way, there are many different Hebrew words that are translated sin. They simply don't have an exact English equivalent. But in this particular one, verse 6 means diverted from the path that God planned. A very interesting application. Sin in verse 6 means diverted from the path that God had planned. God had made a great provision for his people. He had established the nation in the first place. He had made a promise to Abraham many years ago, and all those things were still in play. God had a plan and a path outlined for them. However, they diverted from God's plan and went out on their own direction. Their sin rendered the people guilty before the judge of the universe. I'm reminded a little bit back when Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden. They had enjoyed a perfect fellowship with God. We can't even imagine what that fellowship must have been like, and when there was no understanding of what was right and what is wrong. When it said they were told to tend the garden, but things like weeds and things like that didn't exist yet. There was a certain unity that was there. But yet immediately when Adam and Eve partook of the forbidden fruit, then they hid from God because they knew what they had done was wrong. And anytime we sense that guilt in our hearts, we're separated from peace with God. And Ezra knew that as long as the people stood guilty before the judge of the universe, they would not be able to enjoy that peace and ultimately not be able to enjoy the fellowship that God wanted them to experience. They'd forgotten, perhaps, that this is why they had been sent into exile in the first place. They had shifted their path. They were putting security that God would never allow destruction to come on their land because his temple was there. Well, guess what? God didn't need the temple. He needed people who would acknowledge his presence in the temple. And because they refused to acknowledge him, they were sent into exile until the time that they would call upon him once again. And now that God had brought them back, they were drifting away in only 60 years. In verses 8 and 9, we read, "But now for a brief moment, favor has been shown by the Lord our God, who has left us a remnant and given us a stake in his holy place, in order that he may brighten our eyes and grant us a little sustenance in our slavery. For we are slaves. Yet our God has not forsaken us in our slavery, but has extended to us his steadfast love before the kings of Persia, to give us new life, to set up the house of our God, to repair its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judea and Jerusalem." God's people had suffered for their sin. It wasn't so much that God wanted to punish them as God needed to get their attention. But the people had suffered greatly. They lost their homes. They lost the temple. They had paid a price for their sin. But though it wasn't deserved, we're real good at throwing things out in our society today. We give up on something. We give up on equipment. We sometimes give up on people. But though it was undeserved, God had preserved a remnant. He never gave up on his people. He still loved them. And he just wanted them to be brought back into the fold of a relationship with him. God preserved the remnant. They stood as symbols as to how God had preserved his covenant with Abraham. Many years before a nation of Israel and King David and Solomon were ever thought of, God had made the promise to Abraham that his descendants would be as great as the grains of sand on the seashore, that all nations would be blessed through him. He probably didn't even fully understand all of the promise that had been made to him at that time. But the fact that all Israel had been through, and now they were back home, they were rebuilding what had been lost, it showed that God never forgets his covenant. God's consistent, committed love for people is the foundation of hope for those who sin. I think most of us can be very glad that God doesn't give up on us when we first fail. God loves us enough, and that gives us the hope that he will forgive, and we know he does. His grace transcends all man's failures. God's consistent, committed love is that foundation of hope for those who sin. Verses 10 through 15, "And now, our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants the prophets, saying, the land you are entering to possess is a land unclean with the pollutions of the peoples of the land, with their abominations. They have filled it from end to end with their uncleanness. Therefore, do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, so that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it for an inheritance to your children forever. After all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserve, and has given us such a remnant as this, Shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with people who practice these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you destroy us without remnant or survivor? O Lord God of Israel, you are just, but we have escaped as a remnant, as is now the case. Here we are before you in our guilt, though no one can face you because of this. Ezra specifically names the sin of the people at this time. And they had forsaken the commandments of God, which in this case was not to intermarry with the other people in the land that was filled with abominations. Now, please don't think for a minute that this has anything to do with race, with cultures. It has everything to do with the spiritual practices. And some of the cultures of that day, they did not worship God. They worshiped the stars of heaven. Some of the people of the land did things like sacrifice their children to gods and cause their children to pass. There were all kinds of corrupt practices. And what God was saying here is not that he didn't even love those people, but he knew that his own people needed the protection of not being influenced by cultures which would draw them away from his principle. It had nothing to do with where they were born. It had nothing to do with the color of their skin. It had everything to do with how they lived their lives. Mixing faiths quite often doesn't work. And we know that in the past it had caused great problems within the nation. Going back to King Solomon, he had made many marriages that were political in nature. It was supposed to form an alliance with this king if he married a daughter of this king, and then he'd marry a daughter of this king, and this was supposed to be an alliance. But the end result was Solomon ended up building places of worship for them, and then he himself allowed the pagan faiths to influence his service to the Word of God. And that was the problem. And that's what needed to be avoided. Anyone could accept, and literally, yes, I know we don't think of it, but there actually was a baptism ritual for someone trying to join in to the faith of the Hebrews. And that was certainly always available. God had always intended that his people would be a nation of priests to the world. Therefore, it had nothing to do with the fact that they weren't Israelites. It had everything to do that God wanted to protect his children from falling away from his perfect law. Marriages at that time were often not made with the purpose of a couple being in love or favor, but they were often done to unite those of social influence and wealth. And that, of course, isn't a base for a solid marriage, nor is it a base for someone to continue practicing their faith. Either party involved in that, and that became the real issue. God had called his people to demonstrate a life that modeled living for him. His people were constantly called to be a witness to the world around them. And the only way they could do that was to be consistent about living their lives the way that he wanted them to do. And if there's no separation of God's people from the pagan cultures around, well, then things don't work very well. Compromise with the world always weakens our witness. Now, I say that with caution because one of the things that we constantly need to be aware of is our need to be able to reach out in love to anyone that comes across our pathway with whatever situation they find themselves in. No one has ever sinned more than what Jesus is willing to forgive. However, The problem comes in when we try to water down or compromise the message to make the message more attractive. It's kind of like if we water down the truth of God's word to make it more attractive, it's kind of like diluting a product. Did you ever notice sometimes some things you can add water and make it a little weaker, and others it just doesn't work well. And if we water down the message of God's word, it is not as effective as if it were full strength. The message of God is always motivated by grace and love. Therefore, we needed full strength. If we water down the message of God's plan, then we are also watering down the grace and love, which obviously will create all sorts of problems. Sin is like cancer. It must be dealt with. You know, there's a lot of things we think we can overlook, but every now and then it comes back and bites someone. Sin that is not dealt with will eventually spring up and give us problems. Certain events become focal points for a period in history. And it's important that we think about things that have happened. I never forget my grandparents always talked about December 7th, 1941. I don't remember anything about the beginning of World War II. I know my father was a veteran and served in World War II on the D-Day invasion, and I know that. But that's ancient history as far as I'm concerned. Few more of us may remember when JFK was assassinated. I happened to be in second grade, and I remember the second grade teacher coming in and sort of trying to mumble out the words to the class that the president had been shot. It was something. But for years, people were talking about what they were doing when Pearl Harbor was bombed, what they were doing when Kennedy was assassinated. More recently, what we were doing on September 11th in 2001. We need those points. Those points give us reference. Ezra understood the importance of the people recognizing key elements in their history, and that would help keep them on the right path. First was the covenant with Abraham, which we've already talked about. God had promised him a people, and that promise would be fulfilled. The temple stood as a sign of God's presence dwelling with them. Now, God didn't need the temple. The people needed the temple. And they needed that reminder of God's presence dwelling with them. Let us remember what God has done in our past to help build our confidence in the future. Let us remember that he will fulfill his promises. Let us remember that he has a path for us to walk in, and he will do everything he can to keep us walking in the prescribed path. Let us rejoice in the presence that he offers us, and let us not walk away from his will in our lives day by day. Let's bow for a moment of prayer. Precious Heavenly Father, we are reminded of the love that you showed the people of Israel. We are reminded of how much you love us. And may we just remain faithful to do your will. May we walk in the light of what you show us day in and day out. your blessed holy name we do ask it. Keep us close to you.